Welcome to the Behind Beliefs and Behaviors podcast, where we take you on a journey of what is behind the specific beliefs and behaviors that impact individuals and organizations. With our guests, we get to the root cause of what stands in the way of everything from health, wealth, and relationships to leadership, community transformation, and societal progress. From topics on leadership, psychological safety, corporate culture and communication, to parenting, trauma, relationships, personal health, and intimacy, this podcast is sure to get you to the source and provide you practical tips to transform your life one root cause at a time. I am your host, Dr. Maisha Claiborne. I'm a physician, a coach, a consultant, and an expert in trauma-informed communication. The founder of the Mind Remapping Company, I help individuals and organizations better understand the brain, behavior, and the root of false beliefs so that you can more effectively listen, communicate, connect, and create fulfilling relationships and results in your personal and professional life. Join us every Monday morning at 8 a.m. and let's get to the root cause and discover what's behind your beliefs and behaviors. Welcome back to another episode. I'm Dr. Maisha, and I am your communication and psychological safety expert and trauma-informed communication NLP coach and trainer. I today wanted to talk about communication, and not just any communication, but effective communication. And that word effective in and of itself is a very loaded thing, right? And we'll talk about that in a moment. But what I want to talk about today is communication, effective communication as a process rather than as an outcome. Now, does effective communication produce outcomes? Absolutely. Is it the thing itself? Is it the outcome itself? Well, let's talk about how viewing communication as a process actually improves the outcome rather than viewing it as the outcome itself. So when interacting with people, many people think that if you are effectively communicating, then that's the outcome. Effective communication is the point, is the outcome. And let's first look at, well, what is effective? Because effective is a very subjective term. Some people would think subjective means that they've gotten their point across, but that's a very limited view of being effective. How do you know when your communication is effective? Typically, and this is from the world that I train and teach, when one is effective, they can tell they are effective because the communication landed in the listener in the way that it was intended and was received in the way that it is intended. Now, you follow me, if you've heard me speak, that I always talk about the brain and communication. When we communicate, we have in our mind a picture of what we are trying to communicate because our brain actually operates in pictures and then encodes things into words. And as we have multiple filters that are between our listening and our response, and the other person's listening and their response. So filtered information is talking to filtered information, is talking to filtered information. Context. So now here we are, and we are communicating with this picture in our head of what we would like to communicate. When the person receives your communication, they're receiving it and they're forming their own picture in their head. The question is, how do you know that the picture that you are trying to communicate, or the visual that the visual of the message that you're trying to communicate is the same or at least similar to what they receive? And the closer that it is, the more effective the communication is. Now, here's the other piece, is that they may receive it with the same image or internal representation, but their filters may filter the meaning of it. And so the other aspect of, is my communication effective, is, was it received with the intention of which it was communicated. Now we know that intention doesn't equal impact, and that's another conversation we may or may not address today. And if we can at least get our communication, the intention of our communication across to match the listener's internal representation or their interpretation, then we can say that we've communicated relatively effectively. That would be the outcome. This is the difference that I'm speaking of. And in terms, the difference in whether or not we view communication as a process or as the outcome itself. When we view communication as more of a process, like the process of communicating, then it brings into the flexibility and the dance that is communicating, the dance that is listening and receiving and speaking and interacting. It brings into the space the multiple layers of communication that is happening, the verbal communication, the congruence between the verbal and the body language and the tone of voice and the facial expressions, because we know that communicating with words, you're only communicating 7%. The rest of you, your body language, your facial expressions, your tone of voice, the energy around you, that's the other 93% that's going to get communicated and that's going to be received by the listener. And so why is this even important? Because whether you are communicating with your child, your spouse or partner, or whether you're communicating as a leader to hundreds of employees or to 10 employees or to one employee, you are always communicating. You cannot communicate. It's one of the principles inside of the work that I do with neurolinguistic programming, the brain-based communication that I teach and I train, is that you're always communicating. And the challenging thing about technology today is that because words are only 7% of communication, when you're communicating through electronic means, text message, or any type of messenger, email, the tone gets lost. The rest of the body language and facial expression with which went into the communication gets lost. And all you're left with is 7%. And you leave the person to interpret the other 93%, the other bit of what was intended to be communicated. And so that can be a big challenge. But let's bring it back to when we're communicating face to face. Let's bring it back to that. And I think that is why interpersonal communication, as much as possible, is actually more beneficial, especially when you're communicating very important things, important decisions, feedback, when you're communicating, and when you're just communicating facts and to-do lists. Hey, electronic communication is as good as any. But when you're actually bringing across a new decision or a response to a request that may be sensitive, or you're giving feedback to someone, or you're asking a question about solving a problem, it's useful to have these conversations voice to voice or face to face. Even if you can't have them face to face, picking up the phone and having a quick conversation, because then there's more of the communication, the various aspects, layers of communication that can get interpreted so that the actual interaction can be most effective, right? And the outcome, if we want to talk outcomes, can actually be more of a win outcome. And so this is why communicating as a process and thinking about it from the space of communicating as a process is very useful, because it brings that flexibility in. If we're in the process of communicating, moving towards an outcome, moving towards something, then you're more likely to get to the desired outcome between two people. So let me give you an example. I was communicating with a friend of mine, and we actually were communicating face to face, but asynchronously. Asynchronously, meaning I have a video app called Marco Polo. And in that video app, I can, put the phone up to my face, press record, and record a conversation to my friend. And then she can record a response. So one day we were communicating back and forth about a professional matter, and something that she said came across a particular way, and I became activated. And so in my response, because I didn't have immediate access to her to get clarification, and we're going to get to that in just a moment, my immediate activation in my response was showing, right? In my response, I was a bit more curt, a little bit more emotional, a little bit more agitated in my response. And so then she came back and she responded, and it was like the intensity of the responses between us as we were going back and forth for just about 3 or 4 Marcos was escalating. The intensity was escalating. Now, what could have been seen as a good thing, which was having the space to respond, was not such a good thing in this instance, right? And so what ended up happening is, after about the fourth Marco, the fourth back and forth of the conversation, so me having responded a couple of times and her having responded a couple of times, I realized that I needed to pick up the phone to have a more synchronous interaction with her, right? Because what was happening is the communication was not being effective. It was not being effective, right? The process was flawed. And this is in an asynchronous video conversation. Imagine if this had been a text conversation or an email conversation where there was no facial expression or context or tone of voice. And I was interpreting, like, the picture in my mind that was showing up as she was communicating was very different from her intended communication. So I picked up the phone. I called her. I said, "Hey, let's talk about this." So I shared with her my experience of the communication, like how it landed with me. And she was able to share, "Oh, that was not at all what I was intending. Like, what I was communicating, I meant this." And then, even digging down a little bit more deeply into the conversation, I was able to share why I got activated, what was behind that, what was underneath that. And then she was able to share how my communication landed with her. And then we were able to get back to the actual intended subject of the communication, resolve the problem in real time, and return to a positive kinesthetic or a positive internal feeling in our body toward each other. So that's just like a small example. And this is between two people who have done a lot of work and a lot of practice of communicating. And the space between us is a safe space for us to say, "Hey, that communication didn't work." When we are interacting with people, and we have to view like this communication is a process, and it'll lead to an outcome. And how it leads to an outcome depends on three things: how we listen. Like, let's start with that. It's how we listen, how we seek clarification, and how we respond. All right. Three things I'm going to share with you. Now, in reality, there are a lot more factors to that. In my communication that transforms, the trauma informed communication course that I have, I talk about the layers of trauma that can perturbate one's listening, the layers of belief and values that filter our listening. I talk about the level of safety, psychological safety between people that can also affect the capacity to listen or receive communication or even express. And I talk about the level of emotional fluency that is or is not present in a person that also can impact their capacity in any moment to express, right? So there are multiple layers that go into this process of communicating. And there are three big buckets. There are three big buckets that when you understand them, it begins to move you in the direction of a more conscious communicating. And that is really what that process is, like being very conscious in every moment of what you're communicating and how you're communicating. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to stifle yourself or suppress yourself. That's not exactly what it means, or that's not what it means at all. What it means is when you are consciously communicating, when you are aware of the internal representation that you may or may not be putting in another person's head, you have the better chance of creating a better outcome with your communicating. And it is work, it is constant intentionality. And some people, what I'll say is, it's not a place where everybody is all the time. No one can be perfectly communicating all the time. So we have to give grace and compassion for that. And the more that you take on these three things that I want to share in this particular episode, the better chance you get at opening the conversation and keeping it as a process that leads to a favorable outcome between both people. So, what are those three things? I said listening, seeking clarity, and the response. So, let's talk about this first one, listening. In the course that I have, in the communication course that I have, that I work with individuals and organizations around, listening is probably the most foundational piece of the communication process. You ask yourself, what filters are you listening through? What values are you listening through? What environmental lens are you listening to? What contextual lens are you listening through? All right. So what are the filters that you are listening through? That's the first listening. Being mindful of, as you're listening, what filters may the other person be speaking through? Right? So that really is the act of getting in someone else's shoes and seeing and hearing and even imagining the feelings that they could be feeling as they are communicating. So, what filters are they speaking through? Now, you can't necessarily say for sure what filters they're listening through unless you know the person very well, but you want to be careful about mind reading. So, you would say, what filters could they be speaking through? And that would help even to expand your own listening filters. And then the third place to listen from is the fly on the wall, the observer. What is the dynamic that's going on here? Right? What is the dynamic that's going on? How are this person's values may be different from my values? How may their role in the conversation be different from my role in the conversation? How may their beliefs and attitudes be different from my beliefs and attitudes based on their background, their upbringing, their past experiences? And so the listening piece is a foundation of the communicating because it drives our response. Now, the second thing is something we don't often do. So, oftentimes we go from listening to responding. We don't often seek clarification, right? This is the question, powerful questioning. We don't often seek clarification. Whether you think you understand, you do understand, or maybe you don't understand, or somewhere, anywhere on that spectrum, it's very powerful to clarify what you heard. Because when you clarify what you heard, what you're doing is you are then putting the internal representation of what you heard on display so you can see, does it match the internal representation of the speaker? Similarly, you give the opportunity when you are speaking for the other person to clarify what they heard. So I just want to make sure you understand, what did you hear me say? What did you hear me say? And then that allows them to put their internal representation on display so that you can make sure that their internal representation matches what you actually intended. Okay. So, this second part of clarifying the communication is the most missed step, because the way we communicate is talk here, talk here, talk here, talk here, right? And I specifically say hear and not listen, because oftentimes when people are listening, they're not really listening. They're just hearing what someone's saying, thinking about the response while the person's talking rather than actually really listening and then just responding. And then the person hears and then responds. Then they hear and then they respond. Like, that's what happens. And so when we take that middle step to clarify what's been said and clarify that the internal representations match, then you get better communication, more effective communication, more effective outcome. All right. And then the third is the response. Now, the listening drives the response, right? So you have the listen, the clarify, and the clarify, right? And then the clarifying and the listening are going back and forth. And then there's the response. And when we respond, we have to remember that we're responding from our own filters, and we want to be mindful. Words are very powerful. Words are the things that create the internal representations in our and another's mind. So when we're speaking, we want to speak with intention. We want to speak respecting another person's model of the world. Doesn't have to, don't mean you have to agree with it, but respecting another's model of the world. That's another one of the major principles inside of the work that I do with organizations, in communities, and then even inside of families. Respecting, you speak with respect for another's model of the world. All right. It may not be your model of the world, but it's theirs. And we can choose to respect that, even if we're not in alignment or we don't necessarily agree. The second is, you want to respond with the awareness that anything that you say could activate trauma in the person, a wound in the person. And so if they respond in a particular way, maybe in a more intense way or an emotional way, just listening with the compassion that something maybe have gotten activated. Now, it could be the way that you communicated didn't work for them, and maybe they set that boundary. Maybe they're setting that boundary with some type of intensity. But when you listen with awareness and compassion, is the third one. Listen with awareness. As you communicate, it carries the risk of activating someone. It just does, right? That's just part of that's the trauma. That's the trauma informed aspect of listening, right? But then having some compassion inside of a person's response, right? Now, we go a lot more deeply into this in the course, in the Communication That Transforms course. But when you have some compassion for the response, it allows you to give space for whatever's going on with them, right? It doesn't mean you can't set boundaries, right? It doesn't mean you can't set boundaries, but what it means is you have a compassion for something has happened, and then you can inquire, again, clarify. What did you hear me say? My communication didn't land well. Name it. My communication didn't land well. What did you hear me say? What about, and those some powerful questions that might come out of that keeps the conversation open, that helps to move into a more favorable resolution. And it could be the person may need to take space, and that's okay. But then it's useful to come back and have a conversation to resolve that later, to leave everyone in the communication complete in some way, form, or fashion. And so if you just start with those three principles, listening, clarifying, and being intentional with your response, right? Being intentional with responding with respect for another's model of the world, responding with the awareness that any conversation The person has their own wounds or their own trauma, and the way you communicate can activate that. And having compassion for the response. The response may, if the response is out of proportion to what you feel the response should be, then perhaps there's some nerve that it hit or some wound that it hit. And, or perhaps the way you communicate it really just didn't work. And we want to not blame everything on everybody else's trauma, because I think that's important to say here. We want to also be responsible. This is the part where we be responsible for our communications and the way we're communicating, right? So that those three things. And what I want you to do is I want you to take those into the week. And I want you to really begin to practice communicating with those three principles. And let me know how it goes. Let me know how it goes. So go apply this in your life today. And share this episode with one other person in your life, a friend, a colleague, a family member. And when you see a difference in applying these principles, share your wins with me. You can leave them in a review on the podcast platform of your choice, which I would very much appreciate. Or you can email them to me directly, drmaisha@drmaisha.com. It really just makes my day to know that with these principles that I'm empowering and impacting people. All right. If you are listening to this and you're saying, wow, we could really use these principles in our organization, in our community, you can see amazing changes in your work and personal relationships, in your leadership, in your confidence, and you can really make positive change in your organization with a deeper dive into learning these tools. And this is what I do, and this is what I teach in organizations. And so I invite you to consider having me come into your community or your organization, your conference, your employee or business resource group, your leadership retreat, and have me come and speak. I speak about communication that transforms. I speak about psychological safety, and I speak about trauma and the ways that it affects our beliefs, our communication, and how we can begin to move down the trauma informed journey. And so, and particularly in communication, what I do is I bridge the gap between knowing about and applying it to daily life. I skill people up. So as always, I am committed to seeing you empowered, because you all are the bridge to the next generation of empowered community and leaders. And you all are the bridge to a new future. So with that, I'll see you on the next episode. And until then, stay empowered. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We know that without the listeners, there is no podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe so you do not miss when we drop our next episode, and share this podcast with a friend, a family member, and a colleague, at least one person in your life today. This episode was brought to you by the Mind Remapping Company, helping organizations create psychologically and emotionally safe cultures that make their employees and leaders feel seen, heard, respected, welcome, and valued, all while fostering a thriving, engaged, and healthy workforce for the organization. Is your organization in need of a speaker? I speak about topics like psychological and emotional safety, trauma-informed communication, and employee well-being. If this is aligned with your organizational inclusion, belonging, or leadership goals, contact me, Dr. Maisha, by going to www.mindremappingacademy.com. That's mindremappingacademy.com. Finally, we train leaders, but we also train coaches. If you're interested in becoming a trauma-informed coach, visit our website as well and check out our NLP coach trainings and certifications. We'll see you on the next episode. Until then, stay empowered.